Hey, are you tired of the left and right politics? I hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just click that subscribe button, ring the little bell, and prepare to free your mind from the traditional red versus blue. Public opinion surveys ahead of the 2020 presidential election were the most inaccurate in 40 years. I'm reading from the Wall Street Journal, a story that has gotten a tremendous amount of attention. This, according to an expert panel convened by the main trade group of pollsters. By the way, former President Donald Trump, upon hearing the news last weekend, issued his own statement on his brand new blog saying that the Wall Street Journal had reported something on which they finally got it right. His explanation, Trump's explanation, not the expert panel, is that it was all done purposely. What are the facts? Josh Clinton is a professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. He led the review for the American Association for Public Opinion Research, and he joins me now. Dr. Clinton, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Pleasure to be here.
So first, by way of background, what is the American Association for Public Opinion Research?
Sure. So the American Association for Public Opinion Research is a group of people from industry, from nonprofits, from academia, who all study public opinion polling in various aspects, not exclusively related to pre-election polling, but industry polling, consumer well-being. Just in general, it's a trade group that kind of puts together everyone who studies public opinion across the United States.
And you're not a pollster, you're a member of academia, fair?
That's fair. So, I don't, we do some polling in Tennessee, but it's not pre-election polling. And the task force that was convened was like 18 individuals from nonprofits, from academia, and some pre-election pollsters to try to get an assessment of what actually went down and to try to help identify kind of potential issues for polling in the future.
So with regard to the top of the ticket, Biden v. Trump, how wrong were they?
So historically, in terms of the national popular vote, it's the worst we've seen in 40 years. So at the national popular vote, which again doesn't matter for picking the presidency, but the polls overstated Biden's margin over Trump by 4.3 points. 3.9 points rather at the national level relative to the certified vote. Now at the electoral college level, at the state level, those polls overstated Biden's margin versus Trump by 4.3 points. So again, that means that if the polls showed that Biden had like a 4.3 lead over Trump, in reality, it may have been a tied race. And so that's a pretty sizable error when you think about a lot of the critical states were very, very narrow margins.
If you go back, okay, so I guess the question is, what happens if you go back 40 years ago? To what are we comparing this when we want to find the last time that there was this big of a deviation?
So the last time we in 1980, right, when you basically had the blowout by President Reagan against Carter, and then you also had John Anderson as third party candidate. And so that's, completely different situation, obviously, right? So eons ago, different polling, different electorate, different kind of issues involved in there. But in the contemporary period, this is the largest error that we've seen, certainly since 2000. So it kind of challenges what's going forward with the nature of polling in general, because things have changed a lot. Now, when we do a poll, like no more than like 6% on the people on the phone will take a survey. If you do it on the online, the internet, like less than 1% of the people that you try to contact will respond to you. And so an issue that's always been present is like, who are these people that are taking polls and how representative are they of the people who are not taking polls? And I think 2020 really put to shine light that this is a real potential issue for polling going forward, that maybe the people who are talking to pollsters are different from the people who are not talking to pollsters in ways that can affect the accuracy and the ability to predict what's going to go on in an election.
Dr. Clinton, to simplify, Ronald Reagan outperformed his pre-election surveys by 6 points, and Donald Trump outperformed his by round numbers 4. Is that a decent way to look at it?
That's right. So if you look at the margin of the polls between Reagan and Carter, right, the polls basically show the race was 6 points closer than it was, right, and kind of favored Carter, even though Reagan won by more. The same election here, it's a 4-point difference here. So it's similar magnitude to what we saw in 1980.
Okay, so the phenomena that you're describing with regard to 2020, was it limited to the presidential race, or did you see it at other levels of the ballot in the election just ended?
No, that's a great question. So it's across the board, right? Basically, it's not just something unique to the candidacy of President Trump. Instead, it affected senatorial candidates and also gubernatorial election. Also kind of, we didn't look at it, although other work shows it also affected kind of House polling as well. So across the board, polls seem to understate the support for Republican candidates, regardless of who the Republican candidate was. In fact, the errors were larger in Senate and gubernatorial contests, right? And so even though the presidential error was problematic, it was more problematic for the down ballot races, which is, again, concerning going forward when we think about the midterm elections coming up in 2022.
Did it matter in what style the poll was conducted, meaning online versus telephone call?
No, I mean, to the best. So we collected all the data we could. So we tracked more than 2,000 polls, trying to figure out, well, did some pollsters, some ways of interviewing, some ways of analyzing the data do better than the others? And what we found, the answer was no. Like, it was across the board, regardless of how you did your poll, regardless of kind of what race you were polling. And in fact, regardless of when the poll was taking place, polls that were done like months before were about as accurate as polls done in the last 3 days. And so this was like a really systemic kind of pervasive problem in polling that we faced in 2020, where for whatever reason, regardless of how you're talking to people, the polls seem to overstate the support for Democratic candidates relative to Republican candidates.
And maybe what I'm about to say is belied by your observation that you also detected this in congressional and senatorial races. But I'm wondering if this is an almost uniquely Trumpian phenomena insofar as 2016 was much the same, right? Donald Trump in 2016 against Hillary Clinton outperformed his polling numbers.
Super great question. And that's super important question, right? Because we look at also what happened in 2018. In 2018, the midterm elections, the polls did pretty well, right? So you saw in 2016, not so great. 2020, especially not so great. And so the bigger question that I think that we're trying to grapple with is like, is this something unique to the candidacy of President Trump, right? And his supporters, voting but not taking polls, such that, so what's going to happen in 2022? And this is the real problem, that we don't really know. Is it the case that once you get President Trump is no longer on the ticket, that polls will snap back and be doing okay? Or is it the case that someone else can pick up the mantle and mobilize the same electorate and his supporters in ways that's also going to create problems for the polls going forward? Or is it the case that we know in presidential election years, you have different types of voters than who vote in midterm election years? And so is the problem really among those set of people who only vote in presidential election years and not midterm election years, that's where the problem is really located? Perhaps also because of the language and the candidacy of President Trump himself. And so unfortunately, there's more questions than there are answers here. And you're exactly right to kind of highlight these as really important issues for how we think about polls going forward.
Dr. Clinton, when I think about 1980, 2016, 2020, in each of those three cycles, it's the Republican who was underestimated in the polling in advance of the election. Is it always the case that when there's a miss like this, it's to the Republican advantage? In other words, and I apologize if I'm catching you cold on this, but have there been any recent cycles where, wow, the polling community really underestimated the Democratic vote?
A little bit, right? So in 2012, right, it seems like on average they underpredicted Obama's support by 2.4 points, right? So there are some, but it's not the same magnitude there. I mean, and if you look across the board, and not just from the United States, but kind of more broadly in an international focus, right? You think about polling about Brexit or Scottish, independence, or kind of some recent elections in Australia, and there does seem to be more recently this phenomena that polls tend to make an error, and they tend to make an error in a, we'll say, conservative direction, kind of a more right direction than a left direction, in terms of overstating support for left-leaning, right, broadly construed candidates relative to the right.
Did your work come to any conclusion as to what's driving this? My visceral reaction, my gut reaction is to say that there are Trump voters among us who think it unfashionable to admit, and therefore they're going to lie to a pollster, or they're just not going to participate in a poll.
No, I think your intuition is exactly right. And this is something that's hard to prove. So, for example, we don't even know what the electorate looked like in 2020 yet, right? And so, we have secret ballots, and we try to figure out who voted and who didn't vote. And it's really hard to look at the poll, because all we know is who answered the polls. But it's hard to know why someone's sick by only looking at sick people, right? You have to compare them to the people who aren't sick. And so for pollsters, we need to compare it to people who didn't take polls. And so that process is still ongoing. Like, we don't know what the electorate looked like. We have guesstimates, but they're just guesstimates. And so I think, if you think about what happened in 2020, right, there was explicit talk about fake polls, right? And so it seems to be that it's not hard to imagine that what happened is that, we had a massive turnout in 2020, like more votes cast for the Democratic candidate and for the Republican candidate than ever before in history. So it's not inconceivable that some of those people who were attracted to the candidacy of President Trump also kind of, believe the rhetoric that, they're fake polls, don't participate. And so then you have voters who are not poll takers, and that's going to be a real problem for polls. Like, if you don't have them on the phone, if they're not taking the polls, right, you're going to have a misleading answer. And so we're still trying to figure out exactly if that's the cause of what happened. But it's, my gut, if I put on my pundit hat, would say that's probably a high probability of success. I can't prove that, right, to be clear. And it's not something we were able to examine the task force, but that kind of resonates based on what we know about politics nowadays. Everything is political, everything, including taking polls, it seems.
If it's attributable to deceit, or if it's attributable to just omission, it's a much more difficult problem to correct, because you can't just add more Republicans. You can't just add more Trump folks, because you're still not sure what you'll get. What you're reminding me of is that Robert Cahaley from the Trafalgar Group was a guest of mine on several occasions before the election. And he was often at odds with what was the contemporary thought among pollsters at the time. And when I would say to him, why do you get different results? He would say, because I hope I'm remembering this accurately. He would say, because I'm really not asking, Dr. Clinton, how Dr. Clinton is going to vote. I'm asking about his social network, his familial network, because Cahaley thought that it was advantageous to ask about one's orbit than to ask them directly. Any thought on that?
Well, I mean, we didn't look at particular pollsters, but I think the general claim is that you are right, that the people who were taking polls may have been different from the others. Now, the problem is, like, how do you fix that? And that's really hard, right? So if you ask about your social network, right, we know going into the election that Democrats were freaked out about polls given what happened in 2016. Right. And depending upon what you constitute your media environment is, like, you can imagine that the fear of Democrats would lead them to see like there's a Trump voter behind every bush and every tree, and to kind of overestimate kind of how much Trump support was. And so it turns out you could be accurate in this particular election, but, like, if you think about how accurate humans are in terms of understanding numbers and quantities, and kind of, we're not all natural poll takers in our brain. At least I'm a horrible person at doing that. Right. So you might kind of wonder that human psychology may kind of interact with that in ways that, you get it right this particular election cycle, but as a general principle, that may be harder to know. It doesn't say it's not going to work, but just, like, you have to think about, like, do we really think that human beings are really good at assessing the political views of those around us in an unbiased, accurate way?
Former President Trump has it all figured out with regard to the work of your group and the coverage by the Wall Street Journal. He says, I'm paraphrasing, good for the Journal. They finally got something right. But his explanation is this was all done purposely, that he believes this was all suppression polling, meaning intended to drive down those who would otherwise come out for him, with the belief that he can't possibly win. Did you see any evidence of that?
Well, no, and it's an interesting claim, because usually we think that and so the work that has been done on this shows actually the exact opposite, which is that people who are in the leading candidate, like, if they think their candidate's going to win, they may be less likely to vote because it's costly, right? And so, some people claim in 2016, for example, that people thought Clinton was going to win because of the polls. They voted for a third party candidate, and maybe that adversely affected her. Moreover, I'd say that the effect not only happened among, academics and news people, but also affected Republican pollsters, right? And so the Republican pollsters have an incentive to get this right too. So you could make the case that, given how bad the polls were at the House level, again, not something we directly evaluated, but, like, if the Republicans actually knew who was going to vote in the House races, they may have been able to win the House, right? They were playing defense for 2020. As we saw, all those estimates were off, right? Everyone thought the Democrats were going to pick up 10 seats. Instead, they lost seats. And so, I don't think the Republicans would want to suppress votes if it was helpful for them to kind of pick up the seats as well. So I think it's a pervasive problem. It's not intentional on the part of pollsters, but I think it's part of our political environment nowadays, unfortunately.
Help us, final question, help us all look smart in front of our friends and family. What's the takeaway that we can share?
I would just be more careful. Just because there's a number attached to something doesn't mean it's true. And so, like, when I look at polls and when I tell my friends to look at polls, like, whatever the margin of error is, double it. And so, and if the difference is less than that, then it's like a tied race. And so the average error was basically around 4 points in state level polls. And so if the polls show you closer than a 4-point race, we don't know what's going on. If it's closer than an 8-point race, right, it's hard to know.
It's kind of funny that the more technologically advanced we become, I could right now go to my car and Waze would tell me within 5 minutes how long it would take to go from Philadelphia to Nashville. And yet all that technology doesn't seem to be improving our ability to measure people's election attitudes.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably, if you really want to be Big Brother, right, you could do it, right? Given that we're all on our devices and people are talking about doing this in scarily ways, but just, right now, the process of calling up people and asking them to give your opinion, especially when that seems to be a political act, right, that seems to be problematic. And so it suggests that, people are doing different ways of trying to reach out to get people. And so it's an important task and it's an important problem. And unfortunately, we don't quite know what the problem is and what's going forward.
Joshua Clinton, professor of political science at Vanderbilt University, who led the American Association for Public Opinion Research Analysis. Thank you so much. That was excellent. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Anytime.